Greetings all! There seems to be some confusion as to how US tanks in World War II were named, with that lovely alphanumeric which seems to make no sense at all, with everything given the same M numbers and then subsets thereof. So, I thought you might like a quick video explaining the various different T's and M's and E's and A's. The big difference is between an experimental vehicle and a standardized vehicle. Experimentals are exactly what you would expect. They can be officially sanctioned experiments or they can be local experiments, but either way it's a trials vehicle which they're kicking around to see what works on it. If it's not an official trials vehicle, it doesn't get a specific name. Thus, what we consider today perhaps to be the M8A1 or the M18 90mm were officially known as the 75mm gun M3 on 75mm M8 howitzer motor carriage chassis, and the M18 with the 90mm gun motor carriage M36 turret. They were ideas thrown out there by the boards, but not by ordnance branch action. As a result, they were never given specific project numbers. And no, painting M8A1 on the side of the vehicle is not a sanctioned move officially. If the Ordnance Committee, the board of officers who decide what the Army is going to try building and which approves vehicles for production, decides to go ahead with an official project, it's given a project designation, a T number. Trials vehicles were all identified by T numbers. Unfortunately, they are identified sequentially by T number per category. So, the medium tank M4 was, as a trials vehicle, the medium tank T6. This would distinguish it from the armored car T6, the combat car T6, half-track T6, scout car T6, 37mm gun motor carriage T6, 155mm gun motor carriage T6, multiple gun motor carriage T6, light infantry carrier T6, crane truck-mounted T6, mine excavator T6, light prime mover T6, light tank T6, light tractor T6, truck half-track T6, truck mount 75mm gun T6, tank recovery vehicle T6, or the high-speed wrecker T6. You can imagine how things are going to get confusing right off the bat. Now, these were not necessarily contemporaneous with each other. For example, the first armored car T1 and the first heavy tank T1 were quite a few years apart. But the second design of each was expected to be T2 and then T3 and so on down the line. There may have been a few exceptions here and there, but it's pretty much a good expectation. Eventually, the Army decided that calling everything the same M number might get a bit confusing, which is why there was no light tank M4 and they skipped straight to the M5. And similarly, the M4 tank destroyer got renamed as M6. Also to avoid confusion with Sherman and Stuart, but even then they kind of screwed up and had an M6 heavy tank. Fortunately, either M6 wasn't particularly successful, and the heavy tank never left the US, so confusion is unlikely in practice. If there is a variant of a vehicle created which is not sufficiently different to be part of an entirely different program, then you put an E or easy number identifier on it. Consider it to stand for experimental variation. So, T1 heavy tank was the base variant, expected to be a welded hull and electric drive. If you give it a cast hull but keep the electric drive, it's a T1 E1. Change out the drive to a torque converter, and that's the T1 E2. And the T1 E3 is the welded drive with the torque converter. These E numbers keep going until the vehicle that has that E designation passes trials and is approved for standardization by the Ordnance Committee. The major types of standardization were standard, limited standard, and substitute standard. Standard, well, just standard. This is the vehicle which shall fill the slots on the table of organization. Limited standard basically means, okay, we're fairly sure this is the way we're going to go, but we're not going to approve more than this small amount whilst we verify it. And finally, substitute standard is, we don't have enough of the exact thing we need, but this does the job well enough, and we can provide them to fill the gaps in the organization. A case in point will be the M36B1, of which a few were required to fill in a gap in production of M36s. When something is approved as standard, it's given an M model number, so that T1E2, the heavy tank, became the M6 heavy tank. It didn't matter how many E's were tried out, the first M is generally the next M in the series. So T1E2 became the M6 after standardization. The fact that T1 and T1E1 existed before that is irrelevant to the M number. If a second E variant gets approved, consider the A for able to stand for approved alternate. It's the E equivalent to a standardized vehicle. So T1E3 was also standardized in the M6 series, but as a variant of the M6, it became the M6A1. It is of course possible for a standardized vehicle to be issued with a modification as well. If one experimentally modifies an M4 medium, which is the radial engined welded hull vehicle, one gets the M4E1. This is even more confusing because it turned out that the radial Caterpillar diesel didn't actually fit into the vehicle very well, so they ended up using M4A4 hulls. It did not make it the M4A4E1 though, because the program was started under the M4E1 designation. The actual M4A4E1, or the first approved experimental modification to the Chrysler multibank tank, turned out to be the first attempt to place a 105mm howitzer into a Sherman's turret. The second attempt to place a 105mm howitzer into a Sherman's turret was based on the original M4, but by that point other experiments had been trialed with the M4, so M4E2 had been taken up by a wide track variant. The E3 was a trial of the Chrysler A65 engine, which also ended up being placed into an M4A4 for space reasons, and the M4E4 was the torsion bar program, which ended up being placed in actuality into M4A2s. This meant that the 105mm on the M4 was going to be the M4E5. Of course, to make things even more fun, the Ordnance Committee wasn't necessarily beholden to any particular rules. When it turned out that the M4E4's suspension was to be placed into an M4A2 in practice, they kept the E4 designation out of sequence, so the M4A2E4 actually predates the M4A2E1, which was a GM diesel V8, by about a year. Something similar happened with the M4E8 designation, which, no matter what type of tank it was based on for experimental purposes, was always the E8. As a result, though the M4 line went from the aforementioned M4E5 to the M4E6, which had the 76mm gun and the T23 turret and wet stowage and the steeper front slope, to the M4E7, which was in reality a design for the M4A1 to have the Ford V8, and then to the M4E8, the other vehicles skipped the sequencing. So M4A1 went from M4A1E5, which had a redesigned engine compartment without there being an M4A1E6 or M4A1E7, straight to the M4A1E8. M4A2 skipped the M4A2E5, E6 and E7 completely, and M4A3 went from the E3 with its Spicer torque converter transmission straight to the M4A3E8. Even that brief shining moment of rationality, however, didn't necessarily last long. In the early 1950s, the US was giving tanks away to friendly countries, but as the 75mm gun was a bit anemic at that point, they re-gunned them with a 76mm in the original turrets, the same sort of configuration that Armored Force had earlier considered unacceptable. However, the recipient countries weren't normally in a position to be picky. These MDAP Shermans, the Mutual Defense Assistance Program, were based off of M4A1 and M4A3 tanks. Instead of taking the next available E number which was available to both types of tank, in this case E6, they reverted to individual classification, meaning that the M4A1E6 and the M4A3E4 are the same 76mm gun upgrade, but not related to the M4E6 76mm gun upgrade of 8 years prior. Still, things were obviously starting to get a little bit out of hand. it would be unreasonable to provide a new A variant number for every single possible combination of improvement out there. Otherwise, the M4A1E6 might become the M4A7 or perhaps the M4A1A1. The M4A1E8 might become the M4A1A2 or M4A8, and an M4A1 with both the E6 and E8 upgrades might then be the M4A1A3 or maybe the M4A9. And that's before you get to the various other base models like the M4A3 and M4A2 and their variants. And the only solution was to change the nomenclature to be actually descriptive. As a result, the only A numbers remained the basic ones, defining the engine and hull type. Everything else became a modifier. If the tank had a 76mm gun, the number 76 was placed in brackets afterwards. Same with the 105. A W could indicate wet stowage, but as the 76 was only ever built with wet stowage in World War II, the W was often dispensed with on the 76mm tanks. Finally, if no suspension type is specified, it defaulted to mean the vertical valued suspension system. If the vehicle had the horizontal valued suspension system, it was specified in the name afterwards. Thus, we have, let's say, the M4A276 with HVSS, the M4A176 with HVSS, the M4A176, or the M4A3 with HVSS, or even the M4A3105 with HVSS. Of course, this is all a bit of a mouthful, and one will see reports from the field describing the improved suspension tanks as E8, or 23-inch tracked. There is a misconception that anything with the 76mm gun and the new suspension system together is an E8, which isn't really true. The actual M4A3E8s trialed were 75mm gun tanks, and indeed some 500 M4E3s with the E8 suspension were produced and sent into combat. Allies such as Canada and the Soviet Union ended up being heavy users of the M4A276 with HVSS, and of course the French in particular used 76mm gun tanks with the older suspension. However, the US kept the best for themselves, and particularly in the post-war period, used the Ford V8 engine tanks with a 76mm gun and HVSS pretty much exclusively. As a result, when one reads reports from Korea, for example, about the only Shermans being used were by default that kind of tank. Given the proclivity to shorten the typing, and because the vast majority of A3 HVSS tanks built had 76, it became standard to refer to any M4A376 with HVSS as M4A3E8. There was nothing else in US service at the time to confuse it with, but the nomenclature has unfortunately expanded to become the default. You will notice though that there were two E variants which were used overseas and actually known by their E designation. The M4A3E2 assault tank, and any tank with the E9 suspension modification. The E2, known far and wide as Jumbo, was only ever intended to be a stopgap vehicle. It was not considered good enough by Armored Force to meet the standards it was looking for, considering it too slow, heavy, and unreliably to be a standard type tank. But for the limited operations envisioned, they did give the approval for the 250 or so vehicles to enter service. In other words, it was that or nothing. The E9 was more of a field modification, again, pending the arrival of the HVSS wide-track tanks. So again, there was no need to formalize the naming. There is the oddity of the B numbers for the M36. M36B1 and M36B2 were both developed not as derivatives of the basic M36. M36B1 took the pre-existing hull of M4A3, and M36B2 took the pre-existing hulls of M10A1s. Thus, you can see why the British gave up on all this and decided to simplify things by calling all their M4s Sherman. Of course, they too lost the plot quickly enough, with Sherman 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and then putting an A for a 76mm gun or a C for a 17-pounder, a Y for the HVSS suspension or a B for the 105mm gun, and then you could combine them. So a Sherman 4BY would be, in American speak, an M4A3 105 with HVSS. And so this doesn't actually really make anything any simpler anyway. So, there you go. You very well may still be confused after all this, but at least now you can understand why you are confused. Right, if you liked this video, give it a thumbs up and subscribe, and feel free to drop any comments below if you have any ideas for future topics that you'd like us to have a look into. Hope you found it interesting and informative. I'll see you on the next one.